If 6 months of perfect sleep can happen to one person, what else have we been calling impossible just because we never measured it? Because the strangest part isn't the discipline, it's that the numbers keep exposing how easily humans build a whole identity out of excuses. And once you realize your brain can be primed by a single word, the question stops being whether you're in control and starts being what's been controlling you. So let's get into this conversation that turns self-awareness into a kind of survival tool. 6 months of perfect sleep sounds fake until you hear him say it like homework. Like bro turned bedtime into a startup metric. But wait, the wild part is he actually believes sleep is the whole game. And honestly, that part is annoying because he might be right. That's the worst kind of guy, the disciplined one with receipts. The data angle is what gets me more than the biohacking costume. He's basically saying humans lie to themselves until numbers interrupt the story, which is rude because stories are how we survive being alive. Exactly, but stories also let us keep doing dumb stuff with confidence. And he keeps coming back to this idea that self-awareness is the real battleground. That part is almost less about longevity and more about self-audit. Like, where am I blind? What am I normalizing? What am I calling identity? Which is a terrifying question if your identity includes snacks and chaos. Mine does, so immediately I feel attacked. But the priming example is actually insane. Just hearing old age words makes people walk slower? So half of human behavior is basically vibes plus suggestion. Amazing. We built civilization and still get hacked by vocabulary. That's the most embarrassing part of being human. And then he jumps from bias into numbers as this antidote to self-deception. I get why that would feel liberating if you came from a story-heavy world. But numbers can become a religion too. That's the danger. Yeah, the spreadsheet can get delusional as well. Still, I like the sleep example because it's concrete. If you know what affects your sleep, you can actually change your life. Unless you have kids, in which case life just laughs at your framework. That parent section was the first moment he sounded like a normal person. Like, okay, yes, a crying child will destroy your whoop score, brother. But even there, he wasn't fully giving up. He was saying culture can be built at home. That part is interesting because it turns discipline into a family system, not just personal willpower. Which is probably why he sounds so intense, because he's not treating it like a mood. He treats midnight like a hostile takeover. He really does. He's like, no meetings, no drinks, no nonsense. And then he makes that cultural point that sleep deprivation has been glorified. That's actually true in a weird way, especially for founders and operators. If you're exhausted, people think you're building the future. If you're rested, they think you're soft. Which is such a stupid status system. But he is making the argument that sleep-deprived decision-makers are literally impaired. And that part is hard to argue with because alcohol comparison lands, though he says it so confidently that it almost sounds like a sermon. Yeah, he's not suggesting sleep, he's evangelizing sleep. But then you get to the bigger philosophy, and that's where it gets spicy. Like the whole don't die thing pushed to an extreme. His framing is basically every second we're all just trying not to die, which is bleak as hell but also weirdly motivating. And then he says if we can engineer biology, maybe death isn't the same rule anymore. That's the part where the conversation jumps from health into civilization. Because now we're not talking about bedtime, we're talking about rewriting the human contract. Bro went from sleep tracking to species redesign in 11 minutes. But his point is that digital problems are easy and physical problems are next. Like coral reefs, health, brains, all of it as programmable systems. When he says it like that, everything sounds like software with a pulse. Including us, apparently. Kernel is the most interesting version of that idea to me, because he's basically trying to make brain measurement as normal as stepping on a scale, which is such an obvious idea that it feels like nobody should get credit for it. And yet no one has done it properly, so here we are. The ketamine study part was wild because he saw his own brain patterns shift. That airport traffic metaphor actually helps, annoyingly, because now the brain doesn't sound mystical. It sounds like roots and congestion. And then he jumped a wall after ketamine like a child with a PhD. That's the best image in the whole thing. But it's also the point that altered states might create new patterning. And his case for psychedelics is really a case for better measurement. Because self-reporting is a mess, and people forget their own inner weather. Which is true because memory is not a recording device. That mushroom story was maybe the most human thing in the whole conversation. He thought nothing was happening. Then one bad Netflix moment cracked the whole room open. Imagine your worldview getting injured by reality TV. That's humiliating and profound at the same time. And his takeaway was that perception is fragile, which honestly is terrifying. Because if perception is that fragile, then all our certainty is kind of a costume. Which means we are all just walking around with very convincing guesses. Dude, that's such an annoying sentence because it's probably true. I think the real tension here is discipline versus living. Like, yes, maximize the body, but what about the mess people actually enjoy? His answer seems to be that cheap pleasure is a bad trade now. Which is easy to say when your entire life is optimized within an inch of itself. Exactly. Normal people are not living inside a laboratory. But I don't think he's totally dismissing pleasure. He's reframing it as long-term design. Like what gives you energy now versus what steals the next decade? That's a brutal question if you really answer it honestly. Because then the late-night snack has to testify. And it will lose. Next time I want to get into the wealth and longevity thing because that gets messy fast. If people live way longer, who owns the future, the old or the young? And if the people with the most money get the most extra life, that's not a small problem. Yeah, imagine two 50-year-old billionaires hoarding time too. That is where the utopian pitch starts to meet policy and gets bruised. But for this episode, it's enough that he made sleep sound like a moral issue. And somehow that still sounded cool coming from him. Annoyingly cool, yeah. All right, let's leave it there before we accidentally build a monastery. Next time, the money problem and the immortality problem get to fight it out. And in episode 2, we get into what happens when longevity meets inequality. But the sleep obsession is almost the least weird part, which is insane. The weirdest part is how he turns it into a moral hierarchy. Like if you sleep badly, you are basically a bad citizen in his world. He would absolutely look at a nap and call it an investment thesis. And honestly, that is the funniest and most terrifying thing about him. Because on one hand, sleep really is huge. On the other hand, the way he says it, you feel like you have been committing tax fraud against your own body. Exactly like, sir, I had noodles at midnight, not a felony. But he is right about one uncomfortable thing. People do treat exhaustion like a personality trait. And that is such a backward status game. Everyone wants the badge of being busy, broken, and admirable. The holy trinity of terrible life choices. Bro, that should be embroidered on a hoodie somewhere. But I do get the social pressure angle. If your whole identity is built around grind, sleep feels like surrender. And that is actually the sharper argument than just health. Because nobody argues with health and then changes their life. They just nod and keep drinking coffee at 11 p.m. That is the real American religion, by the way. But his data thing is what makes him interesting, not just annoying. He is basically saying stories lie, numbers expose the lie. That is a really seductive idea if you have ever been confused about your own life. Because most people do not know what is making them feel bad. They just build narratives around it. Then the narrative gets a podcast and a LinkedIn post. Exactly. And suddenly the lie has branding. His whole point about blind spots is actually pretty brutal. Because it is not just ignorance, it is self-deception with confidence. That part hurts because everybody recognizes themselves in it. Like you know what to do, and you still do the opposite. That is basically the human species in one sentence. Don't die, but also maybe have the cookie. And that tension is where the whole thing gets real. Because he is not pretending people want purity. He is saying, if you want the trade-off, own the trade-off. Which is a lot less sexy than pretending you are above desire. Yeah, most of us are just renegotiating with cake every night. But his extreme version is like a laboratory for discipline. Almost a human proof of concept for what optimization can do. 6 months of perfect sleep is a ridiculous sentence. It sounds like something a spreadsheet dreamed up. But there is something impressive in the stubbornness of it. He is trying to make a claim about what is possible, not just what is pleasant. And that is where people either lean in or roll their eyes. Because the average person hears that and thinks, okay, and when do I live? Yes, exactly. Where is the part where I am allowed to be messy? That is the whole argument against him, really. Not that he is wrong, but that he is expensive in spirit. The life works if you can surrender to the machine of it. And most people cannot, or will not, or should not, especially when he talks about parents. That was the first moment where the fantasy hit the wall, because a crying child does not care about your sleep score. The baby is not respecting your optimization framework. Exactly, the universe keeps one-upping your routine. And that is why his advice can feel almost alien to real life. But even then, I think the useful version is cultural, not literal. Like maybe you do not go full blueprint, but you do stop glorifying collapse. That alone would be a huge civilization upgrade. Imagine that. People bragging about being rested. Honestly, that would feel revolutionary. And then there is the psychedelics and brain data part, which I love. Because suddenly he is not just talking about health, he is talking about perception. And perception is where the real chaos lives. His brain scan story is actually fascinating because it shows how unstable we are. One experience, and the whole internal map gets scrambled. Apparently, your brain is also a fragile little drama queen. That is so good and honestly accurate. I think that is the strongest argument for measuring things. Not because numbers are holy, but because memory is slippery. People remember their mood, not the mechanism behind it. And then they build an identity out of the mood. Yep, and the identity becomes a little prison with good fonts. His whole project is basically a war on invisible habits, which is why it feels both scientific and deeply spiritual. He is trying to make the invisible visible so people can fight it. And I respect that, even when it sounds insane. Especially when it sounds insane, maybe. Because if a billionaire says, I have optimized sleep for 6 months, it should be funny. But if even a fraction of that discipline is portable, that matters. Maybe not the austerity, but the awareness. And that is the sweet spot, really. Not worshiping the guy, not dismissing him, just stealing the useful parts. Yes, rob the blueprint and leave the mansion. That should be the actual strategy for most internet gurus. Okay, but tell me you do not think there is a danger in over-measuring life. Because once every feeling has a metric, you can lose the lived thing. Like sleep can become an obsession instead of rest. And self-improvement can become self-surveillance, which is a horrible way to say, congratulations, you have become your own employee. Oh man, that is brutal. But that is the tension he lives inside. He wants liberation through control, which is a wild sentence. And somehow it still works on people, because people are desperate to feel less random. They want proof that their choices matter. And his pitch is, measure enough and you can change the game. Which is not totally crazy, just deeply inconvenient. Exactly. And inconvenience is where real change usually starts. All right, we should probably stop before we all start buying wearables and blacking out our refrigerators. Too late, half the audience is already checking their sleep scores. But that is enough for today, because the next layer is the money and inequality problem. And that is where the shiny longevity dream starts getting expensive and political. Which naturally is when the whole thing gets way more interesting. Exactly, because utopia is easy until the bill shows up. Episode 2 is where that bill hits the table. The wild part is he's not even selling vibes, he's selling spreadsheets. Which is insane, because most people sell a dream and call it discipline. And he's basically saying, if the numbers are good, the story can shut up. That is so offensive to storytellers, I love it. But also, wait, is there something genuinely powerful there? Because if you can measure sleep, mood, energy, and recovery, that's not nothing. It's not nothing, but it's also not the entire human condition. Yeah, the guy sounds like he's trying to turn life into a lab report. Which, to be fair, is very billionaire behavior. But the sleep thing is the easiest doorway in, right? Because almost everyone knows bad sleep ruins everything, they just keep ignoring it. That part is painfully human. I do think people underestimate how much their personality is just sleep deprivation. Bro, half the internet is just underslept rage with a profile picture. And then they call it having standards. He's not wrong that culture basically worships exhaustion. The heroic entrepreneur myth is unbelievably sticky. Like if you sleep 8 hours, someone acts like you failed the day. As if suffering is a productivity signal. And he's flipping that completely, saying the person who sleeps wins. That's probably annoying if your whole identity is chaos. Yeah, the caffeine-addicted founder community is not going to love that. They'll take it as an attack on civilization. But I do get the deeper point, which is that we normalize decline. You feel bad. Then it becomes your baseline, and you forget what good even is. That part feels less like biohacking and more like basic awareness. Except he's using data to force awareness where memory fails. Which is kind of rude, honestly, because memory loves lying. Memory is basically a PR team for your past self. Exactly, and that's why the blind spot thing matters so much. He keeps coming back to self-deception like it's the main disease. Which, if you think about it, might actually be true. Every person thinks they're seeing reality cleanly, and they're obviously not. That priming example is creepy because it's so small. Like one word can change how fast you walk. That is horrifying in the most boring possible way. Yeah, because it means the mind is getting steered constantly without drama. No soundtrack, no warning, just subtle steering. And that's why he likes numbers, because numbers feel less negotiable. Although numbers can become a new religion too. Absolutely. Data people can become equally delusional. They just wear less perfume and say correlation more often. That was vicious for no reason. But it's fair because quantification can make people feel falsely objective. Still, I like the move from story to system. Because stories can be useful, but systems reveal what's actually causing the outcome. Like sleep isn't a moral virtue, it's an input. Finally, the universe has been waiting for people to call bedtime an input. And his point is that once you treat it like an input, you can optimize it. Or obsess over it until your life becomes a hostage situation. That's the danger, yeah, because discipline can become a personality cult. But he seems aware of that self-control problem, which I respect. The pantry example was actually telling. He basically admits he doesn't trust himself around junk food. That honesty is weirdly more convincing than pretending to be superhuman. Because most of us are one open bag away from becoming a different person. Facts. The snack cabinet is a psychological trap door. And that's why the social sacrifice piece matters too. Because every rule he makes is also a social negotiation. That's where normal people hit resistance, not in the theory. Yeah, saying no to a drink invite is easier in a podcast than in real life. Especially when your friends think you've joined a monastery. They start looking at you like you're glitching. But I do think he's right that tribes punish deviation. And the bigger the deviation, the more people call you weird. Which is hilarious coming from a species that invented war and email. Email was maybe the less harmful one, but fair. The child care exception is also interesting because it's the first honest limit. Like, okay, biology and kids can break your model sometimes. Reality does love ruining neat theories. But even then, his point is that family systems can still be designed. Which is kind of ruthless when you think about it. Family system sounds like a hostage negotiation with bedtime. It does, but that's also how habits get transmitted. The bigger thing for me is his whole don't die framing. Because it sounds absurd until you realize everyone is already doing it. We're all constantly reducing risk, just at different levels of seriousness. Right. Some people wear helmets and others smoke next to the helmet. That is the most human sentence possible. His claim is basically that the tech era changes the stakes. Because if we can engineer biology, then natural stops being the argument. That's where it gets philosophically spicy, though. Yeah, because once you say we're now the system of intelligence, that's a huge leap. But I get why he says it, especially with AI and biotech converging. Billionaire optimism always sounds slightly like science fiction with a spreadsheet. And a lot of confidence, which is its own fuel source. The kernel brain scan idea was the one thing that felt genuinely new. Because if we can track brain health like weight, that changes the game. Assuming the measurement actually means what we think it means. Sure, but even a crude dashboard is better than total blindness. And the ketamine study made that idea feel real, not abstract. The wall jump detail was so unhinged in the best way. That is such a beautiful, oh, I'm different now moment. And it shows the point of altered states, pattern interruption. Not magic, just a break in the loop. Sometimes that break is enough to make room for something better. And that's why his argument for psychedelics isn't really about partying. It's about making the brain less stuck with data to prove it. Which is funny, because the most chaotic tool in the room is being used by the most controlled guy. That contradiction is exactly why it works as a conversation. Because underneath all of it, he's asking one uncomfortable question. What if the life we think is normal is just badly managed habit? And that question is annoying because it might be true. All right, that's a good place to leave it before we start rearranging our bedrooms again. Yeah, because episode 1 already has us threatening our sleep schedules. Next, we get into the money side, which is where the philosophy stops acting innocent. Episode 2 is where the longevity dream runs into inequality, power, and policy. And that is going to get messy very fast. The sleep part is the most dangerous because it sounds boring until it ruins your whole day. And he's basically saying most people are hallucinating their own baseline. Which is offensive, honestly, because we love being casually exhausted. He's not wrong, though. A bad week becomes your personality fast. That's the thing I can't dismiss, because sleep deprivation does make people think they're fine. But going full algorithm monk is a different level of commitment. Bro is treating bedtime like a military operation. And the wild part is he's trying to prove it with numbers, not vibes. That's what makes it fascinating because humans are terrible at self-reporting. We'll swear we feel one thing, then the data says, no, you're lying again. Especially around comfort, because everybody wants pleasure with a clean conscience. Right, and he's basically saying that trade-off is why people stay stuck. Like, you can want longevity and still not want the price tag of loneliness or discipline. Exactly, nobody wants to live forever if forever feels like broccoli and a spreadsheet. That's a horrible lifestyle brand, by the way. But that's the tension, because he's not selling comfort, he's selling control. And control is seductive when you're scared of randomness. The priming stuff also hit me, because it's such a sneaky idea. You say a few old words and suddenly people literally move slower. That is psychopathic in the softest possible way. But it does expose how much of us is just invisible scripting. Which means half our confidence is probably costume jewelry. Maybe more than half, if we're being honest. And then he pivots into the whole measure the brain like weight idea, which is huge. That's actually the most futuristic part to me, not the sleep schedule. Because if you can see brain states clearly, a lot of mental health becomes less mystical. Less story, more signal. Yeah, and then the psychedelic part gets way more interesting. Not because the trip is cool, but because it might reveal how fragile our defaults are. Which is humbling, because we all walk around acting spiritually bulletproof. Until one plant and a bad Netflix choice sends the whole operating system sideways. That story is hilarious because it's also kind of terrifying. And maybe that's the deeper point, that reality is sturdier and flimsier than we admit. So the obsession with data isn't cold, it's almost a defense against self-delusion. Which is funny, because the spreadsheet is now the therapist. A very annoying therapist, but still. All right, let's stop there before we start measuring our dreams, too. Episode 2 gets uglier in a good way because money enters the room. And once money shows up, the whole immortality fantasy starts sweating. Yeah, that's where the clean philosophy gets fingerprints on it.